All right, welcome back, YouTube gamers, to part 3 of my 4-part D&D Editions review as we delve deeply into the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. One of the first major differences of this edition over the previous two was the removal of the word advanced from the title of the game. Up to this point, there had actually been 2 D&D games, the Gary Gygax rewrite of D&D called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and the second one that supposedly was more like the original white box set, sometimes referred to as Basic Dungeons & Dragons. In reality, this was a continuation of the Dave Arneson version of the game, and some call this Basic Dungeons & Dragons, but that's actually a misnomer, because those box sets were continued. There was the Basic D&D set, Expert Dungeons & Dragons, then the Companion set of Dungeons & Dragons, the Master set of Dungeons & Dragons, the Immortal set of Dungeons & Dragons, and finally, all of that was combined into a single whole called the Dungeons & Dragons Rules Cyclopedia. And then the rules for Immortals were later incorporated into a box set called The Wrath of the Immortals. So, that was a complete separate game system that had, up to this point, run parallel with Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. With the with the 3rd edition, that separate line of D&D was discontinued. Now, once 3rd edition was announced, there was some despair in the gaming community as I talked to different people. And you looked online, what you heard was they were worried that this was going to be some bastardization of Magic the Gathering. It was going to be Dungeons & Dragons the Gathering, or something to that effect. For my part, I was kind of confident from what I was hearing out of Wizards of the Coast that they got it, that they understood that they had a responsibility to make sure that this 3rd edition of the game was something special. Many of the players or employees of the game or players of the game for a very long time, and they had reverence for the material. So I was actually looking forward to this edition of the game, and if you've looked at my other videos, and I would ask that you do that, you would know that what my problem was with the other 2 editions, which was the incongruities inherent in the various conflicting resolution subsystems and the lack of true character customization, character kits aside. 3rd edition did a wonderful job of bringing everything together. Now everything was resolved, for the most part, through the rolling of a D20. Armor classes were innovatively inverted. Class skills and character skills were now basically the same thing, and all skills were resolved using the same core mechanic. In addition, the feat system was introduced. Miniature play was more smoothly incorporated into the system. The individual classes were smoothed out and giving interesting abilities and powers. Saving throws were neatly redone from 5 types of saving throws in the previous edition to only 3 in 3rd edition. And those saving throws now use the same core mechanic, roll a d20. All in all, every aspect of the game was cleaned up and made tidy. And most importantly, it was easy to learn, which allowed new people to come into the game. Now, I will admit to being on the fence about the feat system. I like it in the Player's Handbook as presented. They are interesting, and it definitely adds to the combinations of that players can come up with for customizing their characters. So one fighter is significantly different from the other. One wizard is significantly different from the other. But it also suffers from crunchiness because over time, in addition to all the feats in the Player's Handbook, the feats in the various game supplements that Wizards of the Coast released, the feat system becomes weighty because you cannot predict the way these different feats will interact with each other. So that unbalances the game. Some feats, as it turns out, become overpowered when in combination of others, or they defeat the purpose of other feats released in other supplements, and there's a conflict there. In some ways, it reminds me of Magic the Gathering in that respect, where you have thousands upon thousands of cards to build your deck, and the varied combinations of cards and spells becomes unpredictable. And somebody eventually comes up with a killer combo, and that leads to banned cards, which is something you really don't want in a role-playing game. Especially in the days of the internet now, where once somebody comes up with something, everybody knows about it. But by now, even monsters had feats and skills and complete ability scores. Monsters are now fully realized characters in their own right. And let me pause to talk about this for a second. It's very cool for players to have interesting abilities and powers, unique skills, and so on. That's awesome. And I don't say not to do that. But there is a downside to it. Because the more you give the players, the more you have to give the non-player characters and the monsters in order to keep them challenging, in order to maintain game balance. And invariably, this adds to the crunchiness of the game, the workload of the game referee, and it incorporates a difficulty of introducing new players to these complexities, which makes it difficult to bring new players into the hobby if it's too complex. With the third edition, the days of small line statistics to represent even the most basic monsters were gone. This certainly ramped up the learning curves for becoming a DM, as well as the prep time for a game. There were also prestige classes, which meant that players really had to plan out in advance what skills and feats they took so they could qualify for them, which isn't inherently a bad thing. It just adds an additional complexity to the game that some players and dungeon masters may not appreciate. And we have a whole line of class books being released, which adds to the weightiness of the game, just like in second edition. Not to mention some of the combat rules were a bit broken or so labor-intensive that no one would use them. I will say that throughout all the editions of the game, the one consistency is that a cohesive and simple system for simply pummeling and grappling your opponent seems to be unattainable and elusive by game designers, which is a shame because tackling and subduing an opponent should be easy to do rather than using your blade, because just killing your opponent sometimes kills the role-playing. But honestly, guys, how often does that happen in Dungeons & Dragons where you just grapple and subdue your opponent? Maybe in a bar fight or when it's encouraged, but we don't want to use those rules, do we? Those things are a pain in the butt. But that's not to say that 3rd edition was an unplayable game or it wasn't fun. Quite the opposite. It was a very playable game, and I can't overstate that. Out of all the editions of the game, this is the one that I love the most. And while a lot of different editions had come out and there were a lot of changes in this edition is still recognizably Dungeons & Dragons. The classes were there, while streamlined, they were recognizable. The game mechanics were fundamentally the same. I mean, we had all pretty much rolled a d20 all the time for everything, even in the non-weapon proficiency system and the other editions. Only now it's smoother, more cleaned up, and it's logical. No more multiple subsystems to accomplish the same thing. And hey, all the cool cosmology of Dungeons & Dragons, demons and devils, the various planes of existence, the alignment system remained fully intact. And when I want to pause and talk about the alignment system for just a second, because to me this is inherently core to the flavor of Dungeons & Dragons, the alignment system. And it's not just because this is dictating character behavior. There are magic items that have alignment. There are spells that affect alignment. It's a core mechanic in the game system, and it adds so immensely to the flavor of the game. And if you haven't figured out, I'm going to do a video on alignment at some point as well, because it's worthy of its own video and a deep introspective topic of discussion, because the alignment system is awesome if you understand it. People that don't like the alignment system, when they tell me why they don't like it, it's quite clear they don't understand what the alignment system is and why it's there. And so I'd like to do a video on the alignment system to talk about exactly that. But the monsters were there. We have beholders, dragons, all the neat things that makes Dungeons & Dragons a unique and interesting fantasy role-playing game and milieu that we all love to play. If there's one negative thing that I could say about this edition over previous ones is that it might be too complete of a game. There really wasn't a place where a DM could tinker without seriously altering things or having to really, really consider the ramifications of doing so. For example, if you don't like the feat system, you couldn't really just remove it. The monsters have feats, and removing them would seriously require working just about every single monster in the game. But let's not forget Wizards of the Coast's true innovation with 3rd edition, the real reason that the 3rd edition was so amazing. And remember what I said in my previous video about 2nd edition failing to innovate, and that's one of the biggest problems with it. I mean, you have 1st edition comes out, and this brings in a whole new type of entertainment, a role play to the masses. Yes, there's original D&D, which started it, but Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is the game that became mainstream, that millions of people have played, and that people talk about. There was a cartoon and all of that kind of thing. So Advanced Dungeons & Dragons created a whole new type of entertainment. And with 3rd edition, Wizards of the Coast gave a true gift to the RPG world that reawakened what many thought was a dying hobby, which is the open gaming license. Wizards of the Coast had truly managed to create a real, universal role-playing game system that many had tried to do before, and now it used the D20. Any period, any genre, and for a while it was like Microsoft Windows. It was the game system that everybody used. D20 dominated the industry. And perhaps it was too much, as quite a few people became sick of it over time, and there was sort of a backlash against it. But I like it. I love the D20 system. After 30 years in the hobby, it's nice not to have to learn an entire new game system just to try a different genre of play. But by 2007, it was certainly apparent that perhaps 3.5 D&D needed some work, a rewrite, maybe some rules needed to be cleaned up. Like its 2E predecessor, it had become a bit of a lumbering hulk. Like I said, you had conflicting issues with feats and things like that, and there were various systems in the game that could be a little bit cleaner or maybe a little bit neater. So it was announced that Wizards of the Coast was going to do exactly that, and I just happened to be at Gen Con in 2007 when it was officially announced. Now, I don't know why, but as I listened to Wizards of the Coast representatives talk about their plans for this new edition of the game, a rumbling in the pit of my stomach began. And there was a foul taste in my mouth. I mean, I went to several seminars where they talked about some of the neat innovations that were coming out, the way all the different power levels and classes would be the same at every level. They were going to extend the sweet spot of level play to last longer, that essentially a first-level character in the new edition of the game would be the equivalent of a fifth-level character in other editions of the game. I was on the fence. I mean, Wizards of the Coast had really done well with 3rd edition. They had really reawakened the hobby. There were a lot of new players. Everybody was playing Dungeons and Dragons. It was like the 80s again. And it was important to point out that while there were retro clones beginning to creep into the industry, because, as I said earlier, things had become a bit crunchy with 3rd edition. Designing a monster wasn't just about putting together armor class, hit points, adding a few abilities, and going with it. No, 3rd edition had challenge levels, and dungeon masters were actually expected to carefully weigh the challenge level of each monster, get the challenge level they encounter, and compare that to the challenge level of his group. So there were some retro clones starting to appear in the industry. Castles and Crusades is my personal favorite, and I'll talk about that later. But 3rd edition was still my favorite version of the game, even if it was a bit labor-intensive. I liked that game. And a lot of the crunchiness of it could be ignored. I like using miniatures. I don't always use them, But what miniatures do is unify what everyone is imagining, and it clarifies the tactical situation in combat. Some players have a tough time visualizing such complexities without some frame of reference. I don't care if you were just using a game token or chessmen on a table with no grid. Miniatures help clarify what's going on. With 3E, though, miniatures were still optional. But also, Wizards of the Coast had done a wonderful job of mass-producing inexpensive miniatures to represent the classic D&D monsters and characters. I like them. I have a vast collection of minis now because of it. When I was 14 years old, I couldn't even imagine having this many miniatures, and I've got them now, and they're awesome. All in all, 3rd edition is my favorite edition of the game. I understand that Pathfinder has continued the tradition of 3rd edition, which some refer to it as 3.75, and I am happy that that's happened because it was a great version of the game. So anyway, this concludes my discussion of the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. My next edition will be about the 4th edition of the game and my view on the future of Dungeons & Dragons and the fantasy role-playing hobby as a whole. Until then, may your D20 always roll true, and game on.